All right, for our next presentation, we have Kenneth Kidd, who is a professor and chair of English at the University of Florida. He's written 3 books and co-edited 5 more on diverse topics in and around children's literature studies. His current project is a cultural history of Florida children's literature. Welcome, Kenneth Kidd.
Hello, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning. How's the audio? Is this good?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Excellent. Okay. All my devices here. Got several of them. Okay. Let's see. There we go. So it's great to be here again, and really appreciate the chance to spend time with you. It's been a fantastic conference, and just want to thank everybody who had a hand in putting it together. It's been stellar. Yes, exactly. It's been so much fun, so stimulating, such a rich mix of things. So today I'm going to talk about Patrick Smith's A Land Remembered, and I'm going to talk about that book in relation to a whole bunch of other books, mostly children's historical titles. And this is kind of both as a way of thinking about the impact of Smith's book, but also thinking about how to open up the historical fiction and move it in some other directions as well. So kind of complementing the success of A Land Remembered. How many of you have read A Land Remembered? Yeah, I had a feeling it would be a good chunk in this crowd. How many of you have heard about it, familiar with it? Yeah, I hadn't actually read it until a couple of years ago myself, but I did keep hearing about it, and it kind of gave me the sense that it was a pretty important book for the state. So Smith published it in 1984 with Pineapple Press, and it's been in print ever since. And I think one thing that really ought to happen at some point is a history of Pineapple Press. It's a Florida press that's done lots of really important work, and I think that would be a super interesting project. But in any case, A Land Remembered, it's a historical novel, for those of you that may not remember it as well. It begins in the 19th century. It runs through the 1960s. So it covers several generations of the same family, and kind of tracks their progress from sort of poor settlers to wealthy and eventually very wealthy sort of Florida titans by the end of the story. And by the end of the story, the family, whose name is the McIvies, are involved in pretty much all, or at least most of the state's important industries historically. So from cattle driving to citrus, agriculture, all the way through to real estate. And what's interesting about, all right, we are working. What's interesting about the book is that it's fiction, but it's been received as historical fiction, which it really only kind of is, technically. It sort of depends a little bit on how you define historical fiction. But more than that, it's really kind of understood almost as a history textbook, which I think is super interesting. And that's something that I think has really, it's a terrific book, and there's a lot of good reasons for this reception. The novel is aligned with the Florida State curriculum, and this is both in the original version of the story and also in a 2-volume version that was published in 2001 for school use. So this is a student edition. And I'm sorry the images are a little fuzzy, but you can find these quite easily online. And these were also published with Pineapple, so Pineapple did these editions as well. Pineapple also published a teacher's guide, which uses the novel to teach language arts, social studies, and science. So it's not only history. In 2018, the comics artist Andre Frutino adapted the story as a graphic novel. And this, again, was published with Pineapple Press. And so this has made the book, I think, even more accessible, reaching even more audiences. So the novel is pretty wrapped up with Florida historical and popular culture. As you can see, this is just kind of a page or two from the comics version, from the Frutino version, just to give you a sense of what it looks like. The dialogue is straight out of the original edition. There's a lot of faithfulness to the Smith novel. But as you can see from some of the reprints, this one is sort of like Gone with the Wind style, so Florida. And yeah, exactly. It's like hot romance version, and so hard not to argue with that. It's also inspired musical compositions. holiday postcards, kind of collectible cards based on scenes from the novel, and a high-end steakhouse called A Life of Remember.
Where's that?
And the association with sort of history teaching continues, remains really, really strong. In 2025, the novel formed part of an interactive living history event called the Great Florida Cattle Drive, which takes place every 5 years and is designed to showcase pioneer life for about 15,000 fourth graders across the state. And I don't know much about this, so I'm assuming it's going to continue. We never know in Florida, but in any case, the Great Florida Cattle Drive is part of a curriculum from University of Florida's IFAS extension network. And you may have heard too, and there was mention of this earlier today, that, this is from the Great Florida Cattle Drive website. You can sort of see more about how the novels being fit into the curriculum. There's also a television show that's being in production now, and some of you know more about this than I do. I understand it's shooting in Micanopy / Perry even as we speak. What I can tell you is that it's under the direction of independent filmmaker Todd Weissman, who's a Tampa native, and it has financial support from the state and also from Film Tampa Bay, which is sort of supports film projects. So anyway, it's fair to say that Land Remembered is pretty central, right, to our understanding of Florida history. And so what I want to do is talk a little bit about what's made the book successful, and also maybe offer a little bit of constructive criticism, not so much to drag it down, but just to kind of put it in historical context itself, like what was going on at that point when it was being written, what was done before, what was done after. Smith was sort of writing at a transitional moment in history writing, when writers were paying a lot less attention to kings and presidents, and a lot more attention to everyday people, sort of in everyday situations and settings. So Smith kind of capitalizes on this new focus in a lot of ways, and found ways to tell what's a pretty traditional settler story, but also to kind of modernize it a little bit. And that's what I want to talk about. So I'm going to do that for a little bit. There's also a lot of terrific historical fiction for kids about Florida, and the fact that this book has been sort of understood almost as a children's book, despite the fact that it's clearly not, in a lot of ways, I think makes the additional argument for putting it in conversation with those materials. You know, a lot of this material was published by Pineapple once again, and sort of offers a kind of broadening of the settler story, which I think is really exciting. So Smith was born in Mississippi, and he earned undergrad and grad degrees there before moving to Florida in 1966. His wife was a native of DeLand, as it turns out, and Patrick Smith took a job as Director of Public Relations at Brevard Community College in Cocoa. And over the next chunk of years, he wrote about the development of Florida in some really interesting ways. He paid attention to a wide swath of Floridians, wrote about migrant workers, wrote about Seminoles. So all of that was in his kind of consciousness and in his commitment. A Land Remembered was kind of the big hit, winning lots of awards and receiving really positive reviews. And Smith was inducted into the Florida Artists Hall of Fame in 1999. And in 2007, Panorama Studio produced a documentary called Patrick Smith's Florida, A Sense of Place. And he was living in Merritt Island, apparently, when he passed away in 2014. So a long life, a productive life. So A Land Remembered, again, is a rousing story of the hardscrabble white cracker family named the McIvies, led by patriarch Tobias and his wife Emma. Tobias and Emma moved south into Florida from Georgia in 1858 with their baby Zech, Z-E-C-H, and began to homestead in north central Florida. Over the time, they learned how to capture, drive, and sell free-range cattle, and then that kind of gradually makes their fortune. They start out very, very modestly, and they kind of build a sort of what becomes a kind of empire, and then they expand over the generations into other businesses. A lot of the action of the book, especially the first part, concerns the cattle driving from their base of operations, sort of in north central Florida, to Punta Rasa on the west coast of the state, and that's where cattle were shipped to Cuba. The McIvies then get into citrus. Zech, son Solomon, so you have Tobias, Zech, Solomon, and Saul. Those are the three McIvy men whose story is told. Zek's son Solomon, so the third, actually is working in South Florida, and he expands the family's agricultural business right when South Florida was really becoming the breadbasket of America. I mean, really providing a lot of food, right? And then he gets into real estate, developing what becomes Miami Beach. So that's an interesting aspect of the novel. And kind of even before this, Zek, who's the second of the generation, starts to realize the importance of land ownership. Tobias, the settler, is not interested in land ownership. He doesn't think that's a thing. He's, that's just not his, the shtick. And Zek is like, oh no, we need to buy things and we need to fence things in. And that's kind of when you start to see the family's evolution. And of course, it's obviously speaks to the history of the state. So reading the novel provides a kind of crash course in the industrial development of the state from the mid-19th century through about the 1960s. A Land Remembered sweeps across time and place, not settling on any moment, but rather emphasizing movement. It's really just about the movement forward. There's this sort of sense of momentum in the book, which is really striking. It's an emotionally compelling story, featuring a really exciting plot and characters of sudden death. Readers kind of experience the ups and downs of family life, including some really awful losses. Some of you may remember that, and some gruesome deaths, actually. We're not really spared the details of how awfully people did die in some cases. But with the overall arc sort of bending toward their success. And as I said a few minutes ago, Smith is kind of writing right when sort of a new mode of history writing is kind of on the upswing. And this has been called various things: history from the bottom up, history from below, the people's history, right? And many of you who are more knowledgeable than me about the practice of history know a lot of the key players and it wasn't new at the time, but it was starting to become a kind of dominant commitment among history writing. And this focus kind of accompanied and helped supported a focus on non-white and or minority populations and histories, kind of more diverse stories. The idea was to expand the historical record to better reflect everyone involved, right, in the making, not just of Florida, but of the nation. So we see this momentum in Florida, we see it other places. And Smith kind of takes some cue from this movement. He rewrites the classic pioneer story, and he does make some attempts to kind of tell the fuller picture, and he actually makes some space for indigenous and black representation in the story. His protagonist, Tobias, is kind of a classic white cracker settler. He's very rugged, he's very determined, but he's also a great family man, and he's not based on one person. It's actually kind of a composite of many settlers, and Smith did a lot of research for the book and read a lot of accounts, read a lot of memoirs, and looked at other kinds of materials in the archives. And in his presentation, Tobias, who again is the first of the McIvy men, is kind of the exceptional sort of white settler, and he achieved success through a unique combination of determination, virtue, and luck. And in addition to his focus on the future, the real secret to his success is that he's not racist. Smith doesn't actually say this outright, but that is kind of the way that it's framed in the book. And it's the narrative kind of sets him up as free from racial prejudice and having really no nostalgia for Southern ways. In fact, if anything, his family is kind of a victim of the Confederacy. And even though they moved from Georgia into Florida, he has no interest in returning to a way of life that's prior to the war. So that's actually quite interesting. And that attitude is really central. He builds not only a kind of family, but he kind of builds an alternative family or a broader kinship family that helps him with the business going on for years, including a former slave named Skillet, as well as two very destitute sort of crackers who have no place to go, and he kind of adopts them all. And these men you may remember, don't only identify with the McIvys, but they're actually literally adopted into the family, and they take the McIvy name. And that's really, it's sort of a really interesting plot development. And the other thing that's interesting about the book, but maybe also a little tricky, is that Smith aligns his family with the Seminoles. And this is a super interesting plot line. That relationship is kind of really vital to their success over the years. Tobias is extremely friendly with the Seminoles and builds relationships with them. But it's a little bit of a troubling plot line because The Tobias functions well, although it is true that the Seminoles often pay the price for their association with the family. But Tobias' son, Zech, has a secret affair with a Seminole woman, and this brings a child and then a whole new line of the McIvies, which is basically kind of kept separate across time and across the generations. And Zach sort of tells his own son, and kind of tells himself this too, that the white world and the Seminole world are just separate. They just can't intersect. There's no way these worlds can belong together. And that's kind of the line that the novel takes. And it's a relationship that's tricky for the Seminole group. And even though nobody means to hurt them, there's a kind of series of events that turns out to be really problematic. Zech has one son by his secret Seminole wife. He actually gets her pregnant again, and this time she dies in childbirth, for example. And there's even a little bit of the kind of, I don't know if you're familiar with the trope of the vanishing native, but the idea of the last of the Mohicans. There's a kind of a scene in the book where they encounter the spirit of a Timucuan sort of man who tells them, "I'm the last of my people. Our time is done." And basically, there's no mention of the fact that many of the first wave indigenous inhabitants of Florida died from exposure to illness brought on by colonialism, and so all of that is kind of in the backdrop. So basically, in telling kind of the history of Florida, the novel mostly tells the history of white settler Florida, which is not a bad thing. But there is a little bit, in my view, a little bit of a whiff of kind of manifest destiny to the book. It kind of is like, this was how it unfolded, and how it could only have unfolded. The white world and the Seminole world could never meet, and so on. And so there's this kind of narrative of sort of white progress, which is a little tricky, I think, from a contemporary perspective. You may disagree, but I think that's maybe my constructive criticism. So, all right, children's historical fiction. Am I okay on time still, Ashley? Okay, so you'll let me know when I need to move faster. So children's historical fiction as a category includes, or precedes this novel by a lot, actually, with some early examples, including Sarah Faith Anderson, her book, 1939, Stoneman Douglas's Freedom River, which is really a terrific novel, and Siege, which was published a bit later, but is a sort of picture book, although it's illustrated. It's not really a lot of pictures. But these are three examples of historical novels that kind of really work to render the past as faithfully as possible, that were published earlier. And like The Secret River, which we've been talking about, all of them were written by white allies seeking to kind of expand history telling and beyond the kind of conventional story of the settlers. So these all kind of get at Florida history in slightly different ways. So Freedom River, for example, was commissioned by Charles Scribner's Sons as part of its Strength of the Union book series. And this book appeared less than a year before the Brown versus Board of Education ruling on school desegregation. And the novel kind of tackles racial discrimination in the 50s by returning to the historical point at which Florida joins the Union as a so-called slave state. So there's a kind of plot line that sort of works through those parallels, telling the story of really three boys technically, but really two boys. One black child who is essentially an escaped slave, and then a white boy settler who kind of has to wrestle with his conscience about what to do. And then there is a Miccosukee boy named Billy who kind of functions as their guide. He's a more minor character, but it's a really, really interesting novel. And these other stories, I won't talk about them now just for reasons of time, but they're all really worth checking out. I think I really like Siege too, which is told from the perspective of the Spanish. It's sort of about the invasion of St. Augustine by English forces, and it really sort of tells the story from that perspective, and you really are sort of horrified when the English come in and take over. And it's just it's a nice reversal or expansion of perspective. So this continues into the more contemporary moment. In the early 2000s, Pineapple once again launched its Florida Historical Fiction for Youth series. And it's comprised of 6 titles, actually. I only show you, I think, 5 here for some reason. But in any case, one of them was sort of grandfathered in and was published in the late 90s. But this was all the first decade or so, of of the 2000s, of the 21st century. And they're all terrific, and of the 6, 3 of them take the perspective of non-white characters, and 3 of them are set in the 19th century, 3 are set in more contemporary times. There are other standalone titles as well that Pineapple publishes that aren't part of the series, such as El Lector and Paintbrushes and Arrows. Those are 2 more that are really excellent. And what you can see in all of these examples is a kind of both the popularity of settler historical fiction, but also, again, the attempt to kind of broaden that story and sort of include more voices and kind of take angles that weren't taken before, even if it's the same history. And there's a lot of good examples. Escape to the Everglades, which is the first one up here on the left, for example, is told from the perspective of a Seminole boy. It's set in 1838 during the Second Seminole War. And it's a terrific book, and the boy actually, he's a mixed heritage, but he decides that he really wants to support the Seminole cause and actually goes to Osceola and winds up in prison with Osceola and Wildcat in the Castillo. And it's told from that perspective. The Treasure of Amelia Island is also really fantastic. This is set in 1813, before Spain cedes Florida to the United States. Super interesting, but partly because it spotlights a really fascinating family, the Kingsley family, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and especially Anna Jai, who's from Senegal, who's a former slave, becomes a slave owner, but also becomes a really interesting example of a kind of independent sort of businesswoman and sort of matriarch in her own time. And you know, as it turns out, they have to, once the U.S. is in possession, they actually flee the States because slavery is now, back and forth, and they go to Haiti. Other examples, Solomon, I would just call attention to, which is sort of the first story which centers sort of black settlers. And this is a homestead story, 1866 to 1868. It really reads a lot like a kind of adaptation of a Land Remembered. I think that was a pretty heavy influence. It's a little problematic in the sense that the book does kind of romanticize plantation life. So the characters do sort of say, well, in some ways, life was a lot easier when we were on the plantation. And so there's that. And I think, the question of how to receive that is maybe not that simplistic, but it's worth thinking about. And then the series, just mentioned really quickly, it kind of rounds out with a couple of World War II stories, and that bring us up to a somewhat more contemporary moment. And these 2 are really interesting, Blue Man Rider and The Spy Who Came In From the Sea. So my talk is really basically, if you liked this book, you're going to love these books. Check them out. We could say a lot more about the Pineapple titles, but I want to end, and I know I'm getting close to being out of time, just by telling you about 2 more titles that I think are really worth knowing if you're interested in historical fiction about Florida, that again do speak in interesting ways to this broader tradition. One is Copper Sun, which is Sharon Draper's historical novel. I think this is the first black authored historical novel for kids with a Florida setting. May be wrong, but it's one of the few in any case. There may be earlier ones, but it took a really long time for that to happen. The book came out with a major press. It's set at the very end in Fort Mose. So it has a Florida setting kind of at the end, and it tells the story of someone who escapes a slave situation, finds her way not north, but south to Fort Mose, because they're in South Carolina, I think. And it's a terrific book. It's won lots of awards, and it really gets into the complicated history of Fort Mose, which is fascinating in and of itself, so that's something worth spending some time with. And then the last title I'll just spotlight by way of closing is a more contemporary book, which is, as far as I can tell, the only black-centered, black-authored Florida title for kids with a contemporary setting. But it does actually have a historical sensibility. I don't know if I'd call it historical fiction exactly, but it actually does address the 20th century. And it's a graphic novel. This is Swim Team by Johnny Christmas. It's really good. And the plot revolves around the history of racial discrimination in swimming pools, and the history of swimming instruction in water, and so that's been touched on at this conference as well. But super interesting, gorgeous book. I recommend it highly. So as all these examples suggest, we've come a long way, I think, in Florida set historical fiction for kids. But there are still a lot of opportunities, right, to tell stories that haven't yet been told and to amplify voices that need amplification. So my hope is that A Land Remembered and maybe the TV show will kind of be another sort of incentive, right, to people paying attention to the history and thinking about the possibilities. And maybe some of you will write the next installments. All right, so I'll stop there. Thank you very much.